I'm Sandy Ibrahim. I'm a member of the Welsh Youth Parliament. And first things first, I just want to welcome everyone that is with us today, and also thank you for giving from your own time to come up here. This next session is going to be Cymru and Dyfodol, or Our Future Wales, which is going to be with Sophie Howe. Basically, we are in she's the future commissioner, future Wales commission. Future Generation Commissioner for Wales. As a Welsh Youth Parliament member, I strongly believe that we and them, like future generation, we do this kind of the same work, like taking young people's opinion, making sure that everything is right, they're getting the rights. And when I go to meet young people, that's mainly like my role and stuff, I always make sure that I get what I want. So what I mainly want from them is to get their opinion here, get what they want to change, and also make sure everything is right and they enjoy it. And that's what Future Generation for Wales mainly do. So the event is going to be in partnership with Future Generation for Wales. Hope you all enjoy the session, and just want to thank you everyone. I'm going to pass over to Sophie now to continue. Thank you.
We know that it can often feel that our voices are lost or insignificant.
It can often feel like our communities are overlooked and our contributions have little impact on the world around us.
But the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act is about ensuring that you are not ignored.
Rydyn ni'n gwybod bod cymryd rhan mewn penderfyniadau yn fwy na dim ond ymgynghoriadau i ddiwedd.
That's why the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales is launching a new national conversation. Our Future Wales is about sharing our stories, creating opportunities and platforms for people to have their say.
Mae Cymru yn dyfodol yn sgwrs genedlaethol. Un ymateb ar y cyd gan gymunedau ledled Cymru.
In 2020, the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales will publish the first Future Generations report.
Its purpose is to share progress on the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and what public bodies of Wales have done since 2017 to deliver. It will also make recommendations on what they need to do next to make sure we deliver that vision for Wales.
The timing of this report means that its content is aimed at influencing the next national elections and forming the direction of the next Welsh Government. Our Future Wales is about ensuring that your voice forms part of that narrative.
There are so many challenges facing us in the future in Wales. Tackling our climate emergency, addressing loneliness and isolation, thinking about how we plan and prepare for jobs of the future with artificial intelligence and automation, making sure that our National Health Service is focused on keeping people well rather than just treating them when they're ill. We have the opportunity here in Wales to construct a different future for future generations.
In Our Future Wales, I want Welsh Government to be bold, innovative and unafraid to do things differently.
Yng Nghymru dyfodol, dwi eisiau Llywodraeth Cymru weithredu yn fwy pendant yn erbyn newid hinsawdd.
In Our Future Wales, I want Welsh Government to recognise housing as a human right.
In Our Future Wales, I want young people to develop skills for life and have aspirational ambitions to be the best that they can be, whatever their background.
Join the conversation and share your stories. You can download the relevant resources from the Future Generations Commissioner for Wales website.
Our Future Wales, Cymru ein dyfodol.
So bore da, diolch am ddod heddiw, and thank you very much for coming. My blessed bod ma heddiw. It's an absolute pleasure to be here with you today, celebrating 20 years of devolution with the GWLAD Festival. Particularly well done to those of you who came in the horrible weather, and probably, I imagine, if you were like me, dashed out just as Wales won the rugby. So a couple of things that we can be celebrating here today. But I hope that some of you will have at least heard of the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. If you haven't, over the next hour I'm going to take you through what that Act looks like, and perhaps a bit of what Wales could look like in the future. What is the sort of Wales that we want to leave behind for future generations? So I hope that the video that we just showed you helped to set the scene and tell you a little bit about who I am and the work that I and my office does, and what our Future Wales campaign campaign is aiming to do. So you have the opportunity today to share your views and your ideas for the kind of Wales that you want to live in and the kind of Wales that you want to leave behind for future generations. And I would like to say a huge thanks to the GWLAD Festival for inviting me to speak and offering us this platform to do that. So by celebrating 20 years of devolution, the 20 years programme gives us the perfect opportunity, I think, to reflect on the first chapter of our story as a devolved nation, whilst giving us some time to pause before we collectively, I guess, write the next instalment. What do we want the next 20, 40, 100 years to look like for Wales? Now, it's my role as Future Generations Commissioner, and I often say that I think I've probably got one of the coolest job titles in Wales, because my job is set out in statute to be to act as the guardian of the interests of future generations, so no pressure. I did think it was probably the coolest job title until I recently met the Minister for Happiness in Dubai, so I think I've got some competition there. But essentially my role is to ensure that those in positions of power, decision makers, the people who sit in this very chamber, are considering the lives of tomorrow when they take decisions today, and in the way that they reflect on that decision-making process. So over the course of the next hour, I'll talk to you about the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act and why what we're doing here in Wales is exciting. We'll explore what matters to our future generations, the kinds of things that are on their minds, their hopes, their worries, their dreams for the kind of Wales that they want to grow up in. And I also want to hear from you. What are the things that are keeping you up at night? What are your ambitions for Wales? What are your ideas for how we can achieve that? And we'll be finishing off the session with a Q&A. So if you've got any questions, I'd ask that you keep them till the end, and we'll have an opportunity to go through them then. There are also members of my team here who would be very happy to collect your views, and particularly your big ideas for how we might be able to build the sort of Wales that we want. So, as we know, the 20-year programme kicked off back in May, exactly 20 years since the people of Wales went to the polls to vote in the first ever Assembly election. And in our current era of political uncertainty, where every week is constantly referred to as the craziest week in British politics, perhaps it's difficult to understand just how exciting the dawn of devolution was for us here in Wales. We were offered a blank canvas, a chance to write and shape our own story. And I think in order to fully appreciate that, we probably need to think just how much our lives have changed here in Wales in 20 years. Perhaps we can cast our minds back to 1999. So I'm sure that some of you probably weren't even born in 1999 and have only known life in the new millennium, so post Y2K, but for those who were there, maybe you can remember. So it was a year that began with Steps tragedy, something I suppose we could have taken as a bit of a bad omen, but I think it's fair to say that the main tragedy was some of the questionable fashion choices of that era in 1999. The huge hits of the year were Britney's Baby One More Time, S Club 7's Bring It All Back, Ricky Martin's Livin' La Vida Loca. Is this ringing any bells with anyone? I'm not going to ask you to sing it. And exactly 20 years ago today, the UK's #1 single was Blue de Barbie D. What on earth is that? I don't even remember that at all. Prompting me to think that maybe things weren't always better in a time before smartphones and Spotify. So the average house price back in 1999 was just under £80,000. The minimum hourly wage for all adults was £3.60 an hour. And in the US, a very different president, Bill Clinton, was facing impeachment proceedings. So not much changes, does it? We were using version 5 of Internet Explorer, Bluetooth was announced, and MySpace was officially introduced to the internet. We also saw the first release of music download site Napster, and there was a global panic about the millennium bug, which people feared would bring the government and financial systems to a halt at the dawn of the new millennium. We had the first Matrix movie, the first American Pie, and the third Harry Potter book was on everyone's reading lists. And of course, here in Wales, 1999 was a very notable year. So I think there's this question of, was 1999 the best year to be Welsh? So for many, 1999 was the year that firmly put Wales on the global map. We hosted the 1999 Rugby World Cup. We saw the opening of the iconic Millennium Stadium, which saw Wales beating South Africa 29-19 in front of a test crowd of about 29,000. We beat England at Wembley in the Five Nations, thanks to Scott Gibbs' try. And as a nation, we were riding high on the Celtic coattails of cool Cymru. And of course, we had the referendum on devolution, which saw our very first parliament in more than 600 years open here in Cardiff Bay. We couldn't then ask for a more poignant setting than the Senedd chamber to talk about the future of our democracy and the next chapter for our nation. So thinking then back to 1999, did we have any idea that we would be where we are today? What about you? Were you even born before 1999? How much has the world changed for you personally since then? Perhaps you've made Wales your home during this time. Perhaps you've been part of that devolution journey. Now, I know that I feel that I've been and for me, thinking back to the last 20 years is especially poignant because I celebrated something really important in 1999. So I had my first son. That's him there as a teeny tiny baby. He celebrated his 20th birthday yesterday. So that's me and him yesterday. You can see those eyes of fear, of utter terror. Oh my God, what on earth am I going to do with this tiny thing? And I'm looking a little bit more relaxed. So it was an important year for me as well. And I can, barely believe really that 20 years have gone by since this day. During the last 20 years, my husband and I have brought another 4 children into the world, moved house twice. Sometimes it feels like I'm raising half the future generations of Wales personally. But it does give me that insight into what our Generation Zs are talking about and thinking about, and they have some hugely big and ambitious ideas, even if they are continually SMHing at me. Anyone know what an SMH is? If you've got kids, there you are. Gentleman in the green there is doing that. Shake my head. He's like, Mum, SMH. This is what I get at home all the time. So I think it's safe to say that I had no idea that my life would necessarily work out this way. But then I suppose who does? How many of us really can say that we've got a plan for the next 20 years or even beyond? We might have a pensions plan or a savings plan or just some sort of dream or ambition of where we'd like to picture ourselves in 2 decades' time. But it does seem that as human beings, we find it very difficult to plan for the future. It's, and that's probably why we are so bad at things like savings, pensions and so on. And I think you've only got to look at our current political situation in the UK to realise that thinking for the next 20 years is barely on the agenda. So getting us just to the end of October is everyone's definition of long-term at the moment. And that is a huge challenge. But it's never been more vital that collectively we are thinking and planning for the future. So when we know that we have just 11 years left to prevent irreversible climate change and to preserve our natural environments for future generations, a failure to plan for the long term is not just foolish, but a complete abandonment on behalf of the rights of our future generations. Because whilst it's tempting to think that not all that much has changed since 1999, after all, the 90s fashions are back on Vogue. Netflix statistics show that Friends is still the most popular TV show with young people who weren't even born when it originally came out, and they're still making Star Wars movies. But in reality, the world in which we live is altered beyond recognition. We've never been more global or connected to each other. And yet, across the world, politicians seem to think that isolationism is the way forward. We've lost over 2/3 of our wildlife and biodiversity. We live in a world of widening inequalities, with the richest 1% owning the same wealth as the bottom 48%. We've put more carbon into the atmosphere in the past 20 years than ever before in the post-industrial era. And we can't say that we didn't know about that. This generation has put more carbon into the atmosphere since Al Gore published his first Inconvenient Truth, since the United Nations published their first framework for action on climate change. We've done more damage to our planet since then, and we've known about it. So despite our digital age and the fact that we're even more instantly connected to everyone and everything, we have an epidemic of loneliness affecting the young as well as the old, an epidemic which is actually as bad for your health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And so therefore it's essential that here in Wales, if we stand a chance of being ready for the next 20 years, that our government and our public services are taking decisions today that are not at the disadvantage of those who are yet to be born. That in 20 years' time, future generations won't be sat here asking, why didn't you do more? And I think there's a very real chance at the moment they probably will be asking, why didn't you do more? You knew that these things were coming. Why didn't you do more, not only to dream of a better future, but to actually make that better future a reality? And whilst having the job title of Future Generations Commissioner might sound like something like a bit of a public sector mystic meg, planning properly for the future is something that a number of governments are now starting to take seriously. Not enough governments, but a number of governments are taking up the mantle. And I was recently in South Korea spending some time with their Futures Institute, finding out what they're doing to prepare for the next century. So some fascinating experiences. So here I am trying out a VR headset. It might seem all a bit out there, but this technology is already available, and the sorts of things that they are looking at in their Museum of the Future is all based on tech which is in development at the moment. So it maps and simulates the technology which is already available. So there I travelled to an underwater city on the Hyperloop, which is being developed by Elon Musk. And when it's ready, the predictions are it'll be able to take us from London to Glasgow in around about 90 minutes. I performed surgery using robotic arms following an AI diagnosis. I interacted with the holograms of leaders representing the Federation of Europe, the federations of North America and Africa. Those talking about this technology as the future really are already 2 steps behind. And when in public services we're just about at the level of being able to pay our council tax online, I think we can say that we have a very long way to go. So whilst no one can hold all of the answers to the questions of the future, and actually we probably shouldn't talk about the future because there are futures. There are many futures depending on the sorts of decisions that we take today. What we can say, however, for certain is that things are changing. And if there's another GWLAD festival in 20 years' time, what could that look like? In 2040, what will we all be doing? So predictions for our world in 2040 show that by 2040 hereditary diseases will have been eradicated. Surgeons will use remote robots to perform operations anywhere in the world. New blood will be generated inside patients' bodies, removing the need for blood donors. Security systems will be based on our biometrics, and hackers will be the new burglars. New houses will be printed by 3D on site. They will incorporate network connections and sensors in their walls and floors, and they will be assembled by robots. Most new build dwellings in 2040 will be energy positive, and the smart home of the mid-21st century will be in a hub in what's known as the Internet of Things. We'll be using 7G, which will be at least 100,000 times faster than the 5G that we're just experiencing now. Any of you on Facebook? Yeah, a number of you? Well, by 2040, the dead will outnumber the living on Facebook, as our Generation Zs have moved off Facebook. They moved off Facebook as soon as their mothers, like me, arrived on Facebook. And instead, what they are doing is posting beautifully created images on Instagram, whilst the rest of us post slightly fuzzy and blurry pictures on Facebook of our kids and our grandkids. So more dead than living on Facebook by 2040. Smart fridges will monitor our food and reorder our supplies. The much maligned millennial generation will be well into middle age, and the generations following them will be increasingly digitally immersed and expected to live in a constantly connected world. With a single word of command, occupants of a smart house in 2040 will be able to turn their living area into a totally immersive cinema experience. This theatre will combine virtual reality, augmented reality and holographic technologies to create stunningly realistic and immersive gaming, travel, educational, sporting and entertainment experiences. Humans will not need to wear any special glasses or headgear and will literally stand or sit inside virtual events as they take place around them. In fact, some experts have gone further to paint a picture of our lives in 2040. So if you picture this, so how am I this morning? You ask the mirror in your bathroom. It's the first day of February 2040. You're good to go, Sophie. Your virtual assistant Mark answers in your ear, but you've already guessed that. The diagnostic systems and sensors built into your bedroom and your bathroom have been monitoring you and carrying out silent and invisible medical checks whilst you slept. As you got out of bed, used the bathroom, took a shower and began to prep for the day ahead. You would have already been told if there was something unusual in your sleep pattern, in your gait, if the analytical and diagnostic systems in your toilet had found something unusual, if your toothbrush had detected a fever or something suspect in your breath, if the bathroom mirror had spotted any signs of cardiovascular problems, or if the house air management system had detected unexpected bacteria or viruses. And of course, your own body network has been constantly scanning and recording your vital signs and communicating that information to your domestic network hub. Now, this might all sound a bit like a scene from a sci-fi movie, than what might actually happen, but these things are the sorts of things that we are likely to be experiencing in the future. And therefore, when we're thinking about a government commitment now to build 20,000 affordable homes, how does this reflect, or how does it prepare for some of these technological developments? How does it prepare for or tackle the climate emergency by making sure, for example, they are carbon positive? So these are things actually that are not that far away. It's clear that these issues are not just for our scientists and our philosophers to debate. These pose real dilemmas for those working in policy making. And what will this mean for the future of our governments, the way in which we design policies, and for the future of our public services? So when some of the things that we're debating today is the widening gap in terms of income inequality, some of the things that we might be debating in the future is what about equality between humans, enhanced humans and AI? How will we all live together? So in a world where there will be humans as we are now, enhanced humans who will be able to have wiped out any hereditary diseases, who might have bionic arms or legs in order to deal with particular illnesses. And then we'll be living alongside artificial intelligence. We'll be working hand in hand with robots. What will that mean in terms of potential inequality and inequity in our society? These are some of the big questions that future governments are going to be thinking about. So in an era of accelerated technology, which will bring hardware changes to the human body, and AI could bring software changes to the human mind, we have not just the opportunity, but I would argue the moral obligation to reflect on the kind of future that we want. And people also often talk about the future in terms of the benefit of hindsight, but I think that we should consider the advantages of foresight. To be in this position that many of us are in today, in a position of foresight, is an immense privilege. It means that we're not just passive bystanders watching the future wash over us, unable to affect change. It means we're actively shaping the courses of not just our own lives, but the lives of future generations. But I believe that if we don't act now, we have a risk of having a lot of explaining to do. And when we think of the future, we're often drawn to thinking about tech and digital, and that it's all in the hands of the dark arts and wizardry that happens in Silicon Valley. But actually, it's not all about tech. There are big challenges in public policy and public services that really are about this concept of well-being. How many of us are, confident that any of these kind of futures thinking and thinking around well-being is actually filtering into the way that we do business at the moment? But that's why I'm absolutely proud that Wales is leading the way internationally through the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So it's a pioneering piece of legislation that looks to improve the social, economic, environmental and cultural well-being of Wales. It places a statutory duty on 44 of our main public bodies, so all of our local authorities, our health boards, our national museums, fire and rescue services and so on, and significantly the Welsh Government itself, to think about the long-term impact of their decisions. It places this duty on those bodies to carry out sustainable development, where they must seek to act in a manner which seeks to ensure that the needs of the present are met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And our Act is internationally groundbreaking, so Wales remains the first and only country in the world to have legislated in this way, to look at all of these 4 dimensions of well-being and to ensure that one aspect takes priority over the other. So where the environment cannot be the poor relation to the economy, and I would argue that everything that we've done here in Wales since devolution, of all of those things, I think this is probably the most progressive piece of legislation, or most progressive thing that we've done. It's probably also the most challenging to implement. Now, sustainable development has always been quite a unique and defining feature of our devolved approach since the Government of Wales Act in 1999, where the duty was placed on the government there to have to regard sustainable development as a central organising principle. I guess the challenge with that is you often get these warm words in pieces of legislation. They result in governments producing a report once a year to outline some stuff they've done about sustainable development. But could we say that that for the last 20 years it's been a central organising principle of what our government and what our public service in Wales has done? No, I don't think we can say that. That's why the legislation has now been made specific in terms of particular duties on public bodies, and I think that's very exciting and indeed very progressive. So the legislation also sets out 5 ways of working that the public sector must demonstrate that they are using. So they have to demonstrate that they are thinking and planning to the long term. They have to demonstrate that they are preventing problems from occurring or getting worse. They have to demonstrate that they are integrating their thinking, so recognising the interconnections between different areas of policy rather than working in a silo-based way, which has been the traditional way that public policy and public services have been done. They have to collaborate with each other and other sectors, so with the voluntary sector, the private sector and so on, and they have to involve citizens. And for me, there's no hierarchy in those ways of working, but for me, if I had to choose one, I'd probably put involvement somewhere right at the top, because I think if we ask people, there is a genuine concern about the future for their children and grandchildren. If we ask people, they would probably tell us that actually they want their governments to try and stop problems from occurring or getting worse in the first place. They don't want them to just be dealing with them when they emerge. If we ask people, they would probably tell us that they're not interested in your government department, your service boundaries, whether your budget spans across particular areas. They actually just want what they need. They want the right solution for dealing with their problem or preventing their problem, rather than having to navigate a complex system. And they'd also tell you that they want public services to work together. So I think if we actually listen to people, we would have a much better chance of getting policy making right for the current and probably for future generations as well. And involving people, I don't think, is just issuing high-level consultation documents. My team did a bit of a analysis over a 2-year period, and the government had issued something like 700-odd consultation documents on anything from marine fisheries to social services and well-being. And I wouldn't mind betting that there were very few real actual people who responded to that, and I wouldn't mind betting that we didn't get a sense from those consultation responses of the actual real life experiences of the people that we were trying to design policy for. So it's critically important that that involvement principle is right at the heart of what public bodies are doing. But in lots of ways, Wales is actually backcasting as well as forecasting. So we have an agreed set of goals that we're working to, and that public institutions must deliver against. So these are 7 interconnected wellbeing goals. I don't know if you can see them on the screen there. I don't think that there's anything really that we could disagree with. So they cover a prosperous Wales, a healthier Wales, a resilient Wales, a Wales of cohesive communities, a more equal Wales, a Wales of vibrant culture and thriving Welsh language, and a globally responsible Wales. But they also have their own statutory definitions, and I'm just going to pick out the definition of a prosperous Wales. A prosperous Wales, as defined in law in Wales, is a productive, innovative, low-carbon society which uses resources efficiently and proportionately, including acting on climate change. It focuses on a well-educated and skilled population with access to decent jobs. Now, not the catchiest of definitions, but if you just pick out a few of those key words: productive, innovative, low-carbon, using resources efficiently and proportionately, focus on skills and decent jobs, not just any old jobs. No reference here to this, GDP or increases in GVA being the sole purpose of what we should be doing here in Wales. This definition, just looking at that definition of a prosperous Wales, before you even get into connecting that with the other 6 wellbeing goals, is all about a more progressive economy, an economy which recognises the limits of the global environment, and an economy which recognises the importance of decent jobs rather than just any old jobs. And that is another reason why our Act is seen as so internationally groundbreaking. It's challenging some of those traditional assumptions about the way things work, well, in Wales and indeed across the world. Now, as you can see, this Act covers pretty much everything in terms of policy areas. And when we're talking about well-being for people now and well-being in the future, it covers pretty much the whole population of Wales and everyone who isn't born yet. So, no pressure there. Interestingly, the Act is also called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act, not the Needs of Future Generations Act, and I think that's an important distinction, because what we've tended to do in public policy making and public services is to focus on need. You need to have a doctor's appointment, you need to be seen in A&E within a particular time period. You need to be able to get into your car and go to work, and you need to be able to have the roads to travel on, and so on and so on. Except when we just focus on needs, we miss this wider concept of well-being. So well-being, if you look at its definition in the Oxford English Dictionary, is the state of being happy, healthy and comfortable. Now, arguably, if our needs aren't being met, we might not be happy, healthy and comfortable, but needs, defined in the dictionary, is of necessity. And I think when we're thinking about public policy making, the things that make life worthwhile, the things that matter to people, actually, the things that matter to us is about whether you have good relationships with your family and your community. It's about whether you have a sense of agency, whether you feel empowered to make changes in your community. It's around whether we live in a nice area, we feel safe. It's about whether we have access to the natural environment. All of those things are about this wider concept of well-being, and I think it's an area that public policy has perhaps missed a trick on over the last number of decades, but increasingly governments across the world, if you look to New Zealand and Jacinda Ardern's wellbeing budgeting, for example, increasingly governments are starting to recognise the importance of wellbeing rather than just needs and necessity. So how do we look through a wellbeing lens, and what does that mean in terms of the way that we run services, build infrastructure and so on? And what I have done in my team is I've identified in conversation with a huge number of people what are the areas that, if we got them right, would fundamentally enable us to make progress towards those 7 wellbeing goals. And I think the most important areas for us to get right at the moment are housing, transport and planning, the way that we make places, the way that we build infrastructure and so on. I think it's important for us to tackle adverse childhood experiences. So we know that here in Wales, 14% of the adult population have grown up in households where there's domestic abuse, substance misuse, mental health problems, parental separation or incarceration. And we know for those people, when they've experienced that in childhood, when they become adults, they're 20 times more likely to end up in prison. They're 7 times more likely to have a teenage pregnancy. They're 15 times more likely to be substance misusers. So this is back to this kind of long-term principle of how can we act in the now to prevent problems from occurring in the future. And then also jobs and skills for the future, whether our education system is going to do what it needs to do to best equip young people in Wales to thrive in the future. And there's this quote that I really like, which is, the point of an education system shouldn't just be to educate a young person for another pointless job, but to educate them for a life well lived. And when we think about some of the ways that our employment market will change in the future, does our education system, is it reflecting that? So we know that we're not going to be able to compete with robots. Artificial intelligence will outdo us in terms of capacity around knowledge and so on. And so therefore the things that we really do need to focus on are the softer things in life: emotional intelligence, cooperation, empathy, teamwork, being creative and solving problems. These are the sorts of skills that will be absolutely vital in the future, but are they the sorts of skills that are being taught in our schools at the moment? Now, I'm a big fan of the new curriculum which is just being rolled out here in Wales. I think there are some big challenges for the government as to whether their aspirations and their vision for this curriculum in Wales, whether they're putting enough resources behind it to actually implement it. And I think perhaps one of the features of devolution here in Wales is that we've been brilliant at bringing out progressive policy, progressive legislation, but there's often been an implementation gap. So I think in terms of the future of what devolution should be focusing on in the next 20 years, it's the actual getting things done as well as coming up with the big ideas. And I think that's a fundamental challenge for this government and for this Assembly. As I said, I think that the curriculum is really positive, but then you get to age 14, and I've got children in this age group, and then the curriculum and all of the focus around creativity and problem solving and so on falls off the edge of a cliff, because we then go into a mode of GCSEs where you're being taught to the test, and your skill and your worth is based on what you can regurgitate in a 2-hour exam. So there's some fundamental challenges in terms of reforming that education system for the future. The other issues around keeping people well rather than just treating illness. So I think, as much as I love the NHS, I think we have a national illness system. We don't have a national health system. So some of the big challenges for government, I'm going to talk about this in a little more detail in a moment, is how do we shift to a national wellness system where we focus on keeping people well in the first place rather than just treating them when they're ill. So all of those things, massive challenges for the future, and they require completely different kinds of thinking to change the way that we currently do things. We need leaders who are going to be brave enough to change, and we also need to listen to our future generations. Now, this can be difficult. They often talk a different language. They talk in emojis. As I said, they've left Facebook years ago, and they're on Snapchat and TikTok, and they're posting beautifully created images on Instagram. As I said, I've got 3 Generation Zs in my house. Some of the ways that they communicate with me is sometimes challenging. I'm going to share with you, it can come up. This is a little text exchange with my eldest son, who is sitting over there. Now, I've been called many things. I've held many different roles in the public sector, been called many things in an age of social media. They're not always polite, but G-Dog was a new one on me. I now understand that this actually means gangster dog. Now, I'm not sure whether I'm more concerned about being called a gangster or a dog, but actually, you know, and this is, I suppose, light-hearted, but, you know, even though they communicate in a different language to us, actually, when you talk to them, they're full of big ideas. They're full of, wonder's probably the wrong word, they're full of amazement that us adults, us policymakers, can't see the blindingly bloody obvious in terms of how we've arrived at this climate crisis, around how the education system might not be fit to meet their needs, and so on. And so I think that it's critically important that we are asking our future generations, that we are talking to them, that we are drawing out their big ideas. And we've done, well, we do all the time, but we've been doing this over the last 3 years. And more recently, we've asked, this is making sure that we don't actually land our future generations in some of this. But we asked some of our future generations what they think the big issues that we should be focusing on are.
The number one priority. The climate crisis is the overshadowing concern of all other social fights. Existing vulnerabilities will only widen in the face of this crisis, so we need to address it from every angle possible, and it's really important that we look at it as a multi-issue crisis.
My question to you, Commissioner, is what can we do to stop climate change?
Well, firstly, I couldn't agree more that climate change is an overshadowing concern that is linked to each challenge that we face. So how we build houses, how do we do that in a carbon neutral way? How do we transform our transportation system so we're not, so that we're able to use public transport, active travel, and so on, and we're decarbonising there? How can we make sure that we've got the right skills that we're educating kids in our schools to have the right skills to be able to respond to the climate crisis? Are we teaching them through apprenticeships, for example, to be administrative assistants, an area which is very likely to be kind of wiped out in terms of the job market in the future? Or are we teaching them to be the renewable energy technicians of the future, and so on? So across all of those areas, climate change is absolutely a golden thread. So we know that we can't look at inequalities, our economy, jobs for the future, improving the ways we move and live without ensuring that solutions are put in place in a low carbon way, and that we're putting climate justice first. And I was quite encouraged this week to hear this in this chamber. Assembly Member Alan Davis addressed climate change as the biggest political challenge we face, particularly in a week in politics where the climate emergency has been constantly overshadowed by Brexit talks, and arguably this is a big challenge that we're in, particularly at the moment where these massive societal issues, which we don't actually have a lot of time left to deal with, are being overshadowed by this constant political crisis that we're in. And I think that reality of just about how much people care about climate change has hit home more than ever in the last year or so. And I think that that's largely been due to the pressure brought to bear on politicians and decision makers by young people. So the recent climate strikes across the world saw millions of people stand up and demand urgent action from their governments on climate change. And so in response to that question, what can we do to stop climate change? And of course, we all know that there are small steps that we can all take: eat less meat, leave the car at home, shop locally and seasonally, fly less, switch to renewable energy suppliers, and so on. But I think some of the most powerful things we can do as citizens is to follow the lead of young people and to join and support these strikes. And that was the question. Some of you may have seen this image on social media. So this photo here of Greta Thunberg a year ago shows just how much things can change. So here she is in the first climate strike on her own. And what this young woman has achieved in terms of raising this up the political agenda in the last year to 18 months, I think she's been more powerful than any discussion that could have happened in the bowels of the United Nations to bring this big movement of people demanding action from their politicians and their policymakers. So addressing the UN, she called out political leaders who can only talk about money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. The young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. We will not let you get away with this. Right here, right now is where we draw the line. The world is waking up and change is coming whether you like it or not. So young people like Greta have had enough of democratic systems that render them voiceless and fail to factor in their futures in their decisions. But we know that if we're to stand a chance of keeping within the limits of the Paris Agreement and acting within the 12 years set out by the IPCC to limit catastrophic effects of climate change, then we have to change the ways that we live and work. And I think what Greta identifies is that whilst we can all play our part, it is up to our governments to lead by example. And that's why I've been questioning the Welsh Government on the amount that they're spending on decarbonisation. So you'll be aware that they declared, and well done to them, they were the first government in the UK to declare a climate emergency. But what does that actually mean in practice? My analysis and monitoring of their budget last year showed that they were only spending around 1% on actions to decarbonise. That is nowhere near the level of financing that we need to see to tackle this climate emergency, and indeed is considerably, lagging considerably behind other countries across the world, and indeed in the UK in key areas of investment such as public transport, active travel, energy and regreening of our land. Now, I've recently published a 10-point plan on how they should approach this, and my estimates are that roughly 991 million will be needed to be invested in these key areas if we're to meet the demands of the task ahead of us. And I'll be closely monitoring the shift in spend in this coming budget round. I've just written to every minister in the Cabinet to ask them to explain to me how they're assessing spend against decarbonisation targets, and I'm in the process of following that up with a series of meetings. What I can say at the moment is I can't see the formula that they are applying to their budgets, and that is absolutely crucial, and I will not be letting that one drop, and they're going to have some explaining to do to me and indeed to the thousands and thousands of people who are part of this growing movement. But I was encouraged again by discussions in the Chamber this week where Alan Davis said, I do not believe that we could agree any budget that does not agree significant investment in addressing the causes of climate change. So declaring a climate emergency is great, but words alone are not enough, and we need the actions to ensure that we're turning this rhetoric into reality. And as Beth said in the video, and if you don't, the Beth in the video there is our Greta Thunberg. She's led the climate strike movement here in Wales with lots of other passionate young people. But she said we cannot treat this as a separate issue. So for too long, those in positions of power have viewed the economy and the environment as kind of polar opposites. We've thought that we can pursue endless growth without giving thought to the finite number of resources that we have on our planet. And if you think back, here's another hangover from the 90s. This is from Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign. And I don't think that that's aged very well. When we look at our economic model, for too long we've thought that the defining measure of well-being or of how well a country is doing has been a nation's GDP. So economists and historians and politicians and business leaders have all obsessed over GDP and growth. But can we really say that this obsession has actually made anyone's life better? The vast inequalities we see across the world, our threatened natural environments and our plummeting natural resources are proof, I think, that GDP alone is not a good measure of the well-being of people and planet. So, if you think it's the economy, stupid. I love a bit of a grammatical play. If you think it's the economy, quite frankly, that's stupid. If you think it's just about the economy, that is stupid. If I were to ask you what it is that makes your life worthwhile, would you really say economic growth or GDP? Unlikely, I'd say. What you'd say is things like spending time with your families, your loved ones, spending time with friends, music, sport, good food, literature, the beauty of our environment and the world around us. And even those that say, yes, but the economy leads to jobs and people need jobs to be able to have enough money to live on and so on and so on. What I would come back and say, there are no jobs on a dead planet. So we cannot separate the economy from the environment. We cannot continue in this quest for unlimited economic growth at the cost of our planet and our environment. It's about all of these things together holistically that make our life worthwhile, and we must ensure that we don't forget the softer things in life as an important part of envisaging our future. And that's where I think that statutory definition of prosperity gets really interesting. As I said, no mention there of GDP or GVA. Mention of acting within the limits of the global environment, acting on climate change, using our resources efficiently and proportionately. So I think if we really apply that definition, we have a real opportunity to think about the kinds of cities and rural communities that we want Wales to have in the future. And I think there's plenty of inspiration on this. On my recent trip to Seoul, I was really interested to see this programme of work that they had, where they had a stream called the Chungdung stream, which in the 1950s was covered over to build a road to transport the millions of people back and forth through the city. And then in the last decade or so, a movement started to build around people calling out the City Council and the Mayor around the congestion, the failure to shift people into public transport, the constant building of new roads to accommodate this economic growth. And what they did is that they actually rebuilt the stream, if you like. So they took out a road, a massive 13-mile stretch of road. There are some parallels here, perhaps, with some of our thinking on the M4, but they took out a 13-mile stretch of road and they reinstalled the stream. They cleaned and greened the area. They've made it a tourist hotspot. They've made a focus in terms of well-being of those citizens. And I think they've got lots of challenges in Seoul. Their public transport system is still pretty rubbish and so on. But this is the sort of thinking that I think we need to be moving towards in Wales if we're going to be really focusing on a nation's prosperity through the lens of our climate emergency as well. So if we take the issue of transport, for example, transport in the future isn't all just about flying cars and driverless vehicles. If we think holistically and plan properly, it could be about reduction in obesity through greater uptake of active travel. It could be about better air quality and reduction in emissions, better for our health and better for our planet. It could be about reducing social isolation through people having conversations on the bus. It could be about improved job opportunities for those who were previously too far away, and particularly those who don't have enough money to own a car at the moment. Our whole system is constructed on that, and that is really impacting upon those in the lowest income brackets. It could be about improved gender equality for mums who are now able to access childcare more easily and access to local jobs. It could be about stronger local economies and people able to access their local high street and not have to rely on their car to get their weekly groceries. It could be a number of things if we envisaged constructing a transport system in a different way, because when we start looking at these issues holistically, we see that it's not just about transport, it's fundamentally about how we're living our lives. It's about all aspects of our lives, our social, economic, cultural and environmental well-being. And the Future Generations Act is already driving progress in this area. So I must make reference to the decision on the M4. I think we can all agree that that decision was pretty much a done deal. Before a big campaign, my interventions, my calling out the government on how they could demonstrate that that decision was contributing to each one of our 7 wellbeing goals, how they could demonstrate that they were meeting the goal of a more equal Wales when 25% of people in that area don't have access to a car and therefore we're not going to benefit from that investment, how they could demonstrate that they thought to the long term in terms of the technology and so on that could be available to address congestion, how they thought about it in terms of the climate crisis and our decarbonisation targets and so on. And I think the decision was a brave one, but was absolutely the right decision. And then at a more local level, we're seeing that here in Cardiff, for example, some of you may have travelled here today on a Next bike, although maybe not given the weather. But one of the interesting things that's happening in Cardiff is that we now have a public health consultant who's leading work on transportation in the city. Now that's interesting for a number of reasons. You would not have got that sort of swap, if you like, before the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So Dr. Tom Porter is the public health consultant leading on the work here, which we're now seeing the development of cycle superhighways. We're seeing the Next bikes. We're seeing GPs in Cardiff prescribing bikes, free Next bikes, to people who might benefit from having increased levels of physical activity. We're seeing clean air zones. We're seeing a whole range of different things in development because we've got that different cross-sectoral thinking. And I think that that's incredibly powerful. I'm going to move on to the next question.
And going through depression and physical health is a key element for especially the younger generations from under 30s to 18 to 16-year-olds, because social media is a platform where it's shown this is how it's beautiful to look, or this is how everybody is supposed to look. It's not shown that you as a human being, as you as a whole, how beautiful you look and how you are the best for yourself.
My question to you is, what should the government do to make a healthier Wales?
So I completely agree with what Muna is saying there. We have some significant challenges now in terms of mental health, particularly with young people, and the trends and scenarios only show those problems getting worse. We know that most enduring mental health conditions start before the age of 14. So what is it that we're doing now to invest in preventing those issues occurring? I don't think that we're doing enough, because our current health system, as I said, is based on a national illness system. We don't intervene until someone is ill, until there is a problem. So again, I've been vocal in questioning how much the government are spending on prevention in these areas in particular. And again, it's an area where we can't say that we didn't know. The World Health Organization published a couple of weeks ago analysis which shows only around 15 to 20% of a nation's health and well-being is dependent on a healthcare system. So the question has to be asked, why in Wales are we spending 50% of our budget on our National Health Service? Now, that might not be popular, and I love the NHS as much as anyone else, but if we think about the trajectory in terms of where our NHS is going in the future, where by 2030 we'll have double the number of over 65s, where we've not tackled and prevented obesity, where we've not tackled adverse childhood experiences, where we're not tackling mental health, or the development of mental health conditions before the age of 14, when our population grows, and particularly when our older population grows, what is that going to mean in terms of demand on an already overstretched National Health Service if we don't fundamentally change the way that we do things to try and prevent people needing to come into that system in the first place? So there's got to be some brave and some quite difficult decisions, and I think the Future Generations Act provides part of a template for how we should be taking those decisions, thinking about the things that actually keep people well, which are things like housing. They are things about whether they have decent jobs. They are things about social isolation and connectedness and so on. So those are the areas that we really need to be focusing on, as well as our environment, to make sure that our future generations have access to a National Health Service when they need it, but we hope that very many fewer of them will need it in the same way as people do at the moment. In the coming year, I'll be using some of my toughest powers in this area, and I will be focusing on a review of the healthcare system in government. How are the government embedding the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act in terms of how they're spending their money? How are they applying the principles of long-term thinking? How are they preventing problems from occurring or from getting worse? And I think that from what I can see at the moment, the healthcare sector is an area where change is happening less quickly than in other areas. So I think that's going to be an incredibly important area.
More kind of expertise in our schools and kind of the kind of current workforce. We need to work with schools in that sense. You know, we need to learn coding, we need to learn AI, we need to be learning the current trends, and we also need to kind of instill this passion for continued learning, because at the moment we're living in a world where there's so much kind of development and change. We need to really kind of continue to push that and get people really enthused by that as well.
My question to you is, how can we work to achieve these goals in the future?
Well, the points made there again are absolutely right. How can we ensure that we're instilling a passion for learning? How can we make sure that our education system isn't just based on a review of a curriculum once every 20 years, but is keeping up with the changing pace of the world around us? How can we make sure that we're not just putting all our eggs in a coding basket, which is the cool new thing that everyone is learning in school, but will probably in the next 5 or 10 years become like Facebook. Time will have moved on, and if we're still just teaching coding without thinking about these broader skills, then our education system will not be fit for the future. In the next month or so, I'll be publishing a white paper in collaboration with Cardiff University, which will be setting out some thoughts on what I think the education system of the future needs to look like, starting with completely revising the way that we do exams at GCSE level in particular. So I'm hoping that you will watch out for that. So, what next? We know that we know where we want to be, and we know the goals that we're aspiring to. We now just need to see that happening. So, over the next year, I will be publishing the rest of my guidance for public bodies and anyone who wants to be part of a movement for change, and I'll also soon be reporting on the findings from my first round of monitoring and assessing of the progress that public bodies are making, and ramping up the pressure on our public bodies and our government in terms of how they are applying what actually was described when this legislation was taken through as a Common Sense Act. We have a framework there for thinking and doing. They just need to apply it. I'll also be talking to you, and thousands, we're already talking to thousands of other people across Wales. As you saw at the video at the beginning, I'm in the process of writing my Future Generations report, and I'm keen to ensure that it represents the voices and views of the people of Wales on what you want the future to look like. So you can do that through my website, you can do that through looking out or signing up to my newsletter and looking for a range of different opportunities where we're travelling across Wales to talk to people. You can tweet us, if you like, about your big ideas at FGC Big Ideas. We're wanting to hear what are your big ideas for what our government in the next 20 years should be doing to reach these well-being goals. There's also, as I said, members of my team here who will be able to take down any of your ideas or any of your thoughts as well. So the Wales of 2040 and beyond is not going to be made better by just technology and robots, although they'll undoubtedly be an important part of this fourth wave of the Industrial Revolution. But revolutions were never waged by robots, they're formed of people. And I think when it comes to future scenarios and planning for the future, we need to rely on our best human assets. So that's essentially what this legislation in Wales is all about. So if automation can make aspects of our public services more efficient and remove the potential for human error, we can instead focus on what humans are good at, and that's talking, listening, caring. Those are the things that I think we should be focused on going forward, at providing the kind of care that people actually want and need, at providing young people with the kinds of education that enrich them as human beings and prepare them, as I said, not just for another useless job, but for a life well lived, at designing cities and communities that are built around us as people, not the other way around, at building responsive services that meet the needs of our lives, not expecting people to meet the demands of a service. I think we have a real opportunity to shape the Wales that we want in the future. I believe there is a movement forming here in Wales, and we have a statutory platform and framework to hold our government to account to deliver on that movement, and I hope that you will be part of it. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr. I'm happy to take questions if anyone has any.
Well, thank you for a very stimulating hour. It's been fascinating listening to the plans you have, and for speaking jargon-free as well. I go to so many of these presentations and there's lots of things that alienates the audience, but I think we all had a very good hour there. You referred to an implementation gap we have in Wales. To my mind, that is a major issue for this institution and delivering its policies and funding to the communities of Wales. And hopefully that will be overcome in the next 20 years. So my question really is about implementation and realising a lot of these ideas and the agencies and the people you're working with to help deliver that. Given that local authorities have the majority of this place's funding and are responsible for implementing so much of its policy, I want to ask you, is that model the best one going forward for realising some of these ideas, or should we be looking at new ways, new agencies, whether it's citizen-led, community-based, not-for-profit rather than quangos, and you know, is there an opportunity to specify areas of Wales, targeted areas, rather than hand it all over to local authorities and hope that they realise the vision. I'm not sure whether I'd be confident of that. I mean, the uneasy marriage between this place and local authorities doesn't give us a good track record. And various schemes as well that have just bitten the dust. So I'm just thinking, you know, as you were speaking about new models really, and whether that's part of the work, and whether you're looking at existing bodies and thinking, are they surplus to requirements? Do we need to retire some agencies and create new ones, you know, that are more relevant to young people and the citizens of Wales?
Yeah. Some really good points and questions there. So, yes, I think that there is, well, let me start by saying I think there are too many local authorities, some of them just purely on, you know, sort of financial terms and in terms of, you know, what they're able to deliver, I think are probably unsustainable. I think that the government missed a huge opportunity in reorganising some of our local authorities a number of years back, and I think it's just a constant kind of distraction in a way. Do I want to write local authorities off completely? No, because what I'm seeing is some brilliant practice from local authorities, often in spite of the system rather than because of the system. And I think that there are some big, you know, challenges here in terms of this relationship between government and local authorities. I think in some cases the government here has almost created a kind of some sort of learned helplessness within local authorities, where the local authorities sit there and wait for government to tell them what to do. And often what government tell them to do is a completely confused picture, not clear on their priorities, the way in which they allocate funding, the way in which they performance manage and those sorts of things are at odds with some of the things that we're trying to achieve within the legislation. So, but where, you know, I am seeing innovative practice in local authorities despite that. So I think before we kind of, you know, wrote off local authorities, I think the government's got to get its own house in order in terms of addressing some of the things they do which act as a barrier to progress within local authorities and indeed within other areas that they fund. Health is another example there. But I would also like to see some more innovative approaches to service delivery. Now, you might have seen a week or so ago that Monmouthshire Council, who I think are quite a progressive council actually, launched a programme that they're doing with Innovate UK, where they have said we've got a wellbeing objective to tackle loneliness and isolation. We don't think we can do that just by saying, right, well, we need more carers or, you know, more of the same old service that we've got. And they put out a call to the market, if you like, which basically said £50,000 for 8 different companies who could help us develop solutions to tackling loneliness and isolation. And of those 8 companies, I think they've chosen 2. And basically the solution that they've got is a bit of a tech-based connecting people who are lonely and isolated in their rural communities with other people who might be, you know, driving back and forth to places and could pick up that older person, not always an older person, but pick up that person, take them along to a community centre or take them along to some sort of you know, social activity or so on and so on, and also connect them with like these kind of community connectors. Now, I've probably not done it justice in terms of explaining it, but I think that's a really interesting model. So you've got a tech solution combined with a voluntary sector kind of connecting people solution, and you've, in the process of them doing that, they've also stimulated 8 different companies in terms of growing potential solutions that could be sold elsewhere. So I think that's really interesting when you think about their duty to try and look at all of the goals. I think that's a council innovating, and I think I'd like to see a lot more of that, but the current system fundamentally needs to change in order to allow that to happen. Okay. Anyone else? No? Okay. Well, it just remains for me to say thank you very much for your time. I hope that that you've learned a bit about the Future Generations Act and a bit about what Wales could look like in 2040. And please do keep connected with us and send us your big ideas. Thank you. Diolch yn fawr.